Good afternoon. Welcome to the Faculty Forum Online, where alumni learn from MIT faculty about their research and ask questions via an interactive chat. I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President of the Alumni Association, and I will serve as the moderator. To participate, input a username and a location, and type your question at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but we are not likely to get to all of them, I imagine. Our guest today is Professor Linda Griffith. She's Professor of Biological Engineering and Mechanical Engineering and Director of the Center for Gynepathology Research at MIT. Our theme today is Leading Edge Women's Health Research at MIT. Linda, can you begin by giving us a little bit of an overview of your work and the work of the center?
So my own research has primarily been in tissue engineering and biomaterials, and over the recent 10 or 15 years, we've been applying those concepts more and more, not just to regenerative medicine, but also to developing models of disease that would help us do better drug development and understand both by identifying better drugs as well as seeing that they're safe and effective. And what became apparent over the past decade or so as I served on a lot of advisory councils at the National Institutes of Health, but also became more involved in research with my colleagues having to do with chronic inflammation and engineering of immune systems, is that there are many unmet needs in the area of women's health having to do with immune system function, but also particularly gynecology functions, where MIT had some unique approaches and resources that might yield very, very exciting advances. What I should delineate, we're very, very active at MIT in cancer research through the Koch Institute, and breast cancer is very well represented there. A whole host of other women's diseases, though, are relatively understudied, and that's really where I see an opportunity for MIT to make huge contributions. We thus started in 2009 a whole center to focus on gynepathologies, or things that go wrong with the reproductive tract below the waist, in order to bring new approaches both from the biological engineering, as well as the more traditional engineering to study of these diseases.
Fascinating. MIT is not usually associated with women's health issues. In what areas do you see your Center for Gynepathology making contributions?
So I will tell a little bit about the academic landscape at MIT. As you know, there's been a tremendous revolution in modern molecular life science dating back over 50 years at MIT, and naturally the School of Engineering has been very involved in adapting advances in biology to practical use. So in fact, starting in 1998, we did an experiment to see if there was a new discipline of doing engineering based in modern molecular life science, in other words, biological engineering, and it led to a whole new department, a whole new undergraduate major, now known as Course 20. I led development of that, and the opportunity to use engineering of biology to understand and treat diseases is huge potential. So the intellectual landscape is there. The opportunity to apply this to women's health came about in part because there's a fabulous gynecologist who's now at Newton Wellesley, was at Mass General, very, very interested in working with engineers to bring new approaches, particularly to diseases of the uterus. And so he teamed up with us and said, well, we can do more than just surgery. Can't we bring systems biology and all of this ways of thinking about biology quantitatively? Can't we bring this to clinical practice and do something that you could not do anywhere else in the country or probably the world? And so we founded a center to get together with a foundation grant to try to bring the systems biology forefront of biological engineering into the study of inflammation and women's diseases, particularly gynecology.
Well, as a woman, thank you. What are some of the major challenges to research on women's health issues?
So some of the challenges, so I'll talk about a disease, the main disease that we focus on right now, not exclusively. There's preterm birth, infectious diseases, but a major one is endometriosis, a disease that afflicts about 10% of women, starting typically when they're teenagers. It causes a lot of pain and infertility, and it can even cause internal organ damage. And the challenges are partly ones of federal funding, so there is not as much attention paid, in part because there's also, even in the clinical community, not an appreciation about how serious some of these diseases are and how dramatically they impact women's lives. Even if they're not killing women, they're causing them to miss work and miss all aspects of their lives because they're very debilitating diseases. So there's not quite the levels of funding that you have for a lot of things like heart disease and cancer and so on. So we're trying to bring the forefront of engineering in, because this is leveraged at MIT by other resources, and say, hey, let's have the very first application of this fabulous new software that people developed in CSAIL. The very first application is in endometriosis. The very first systems biology in vivo is for endometriosis. Let's have first in some big engineering advance be applied to this disease, and it raises awareness all around, and then people get excited about that disease because they see people have blazed a trail to study it. So a challenge, I think, is one of just lack of awareness of how important these things are. We're trying to raise awareness.
I have to ask this question, and it's a little bit delicate, but is that because in the past you hear so much about how research is done on the studies are done with men because they have less volatile hormonal structures or something like that. And if the researcher is a man, it might be easier to study men than women. And how does that impact the funding for women's health research?
So I'm not an expert on those past events. I can say that there are a lot of sexual dimorphisms, things that play out differently in women, heart attacks, symptoms of heart attacks, heart disease, and so on. They play out differently in women than men. There is appreciation that now there's growing appreciation that they're different. But even so, studies of new drugs and so on, there's still needed to be constant vigilance to have this included as a factor in developing drugs for any disorder. And I think we're really still at the beginning stages of understanding the interplay of hormones with everything else in physiology. And again, it's very striking that a lot of the immune system disorders more prominently influence women. Chronic pain disorders often are more commonly found in women, things like temporomandibular joint syndrome, the kind of pain you get. So a lot of these things are very strongly skewed toward female, and we don't understand the relationship between hormones and immune system. Fabulous engineering problem with modern biological engineering, where we think about how do we use information sciences to understand human physiology and develop treatments.
Well, and I have to imagine that taking some of the engineering innovations and applying them first to a woman's disease does exactly that, raise the visibility and help people understand it better. So we're starting to get questions here, so I will move right to the viewer questions. Christine at Yale University asks, what is the current thinking on the causes of endometriosis? And will your research clarifying the subpopulations improve clinical management and move us toward establishing the cause?
So the question probably refers to a paper we recently published in Science Translational Medicine, which has received some press, in which we took endometriosis patients who had all different stages of the disease 1 through 4 and examined the fluid that we get out of their abdominal area, their pelvic fluid, and we classified the immune networks there using an unbiased approach, and we found that there was, in about a third of the patients, a particular signature of an immune network that we could then go in and find a place to cripple that using a drug that's in development for other inflammatory diseases. So it was a nice demonstration that if you took an approach where you said, you know, the surgeons classify the patients as stage 1, 2, 3, 4 based on disease morphology, and that had some utility for them, but it's not clear that that really is going to get us toward mechanisms that help us decide which patients will benefit from different kinds of drugs, which now don't even exist. Because 10% of women have this disease, you expect they might have different mechanisms. So we found a mechanism. We don't think it's the only one, and we have to see that it plays out in larger patient populations. How does that get us back? So that opens a window to saying we may be now able to start finding mechanisms that would let this group of patients be treated, or this group or this group. How does that get back to the origins of the disease? I'm still not sure. I think there are hypotheses that it's menstrual tissue that refluxes into the abdominal cavity. All women have flow through the fallopian tubes of menstrual tissue. A hypothesis about endometriosis is that that tissue survives and grows in the abdominal cavity in women who get the disease. There's evidence to support that. There's also evidence that stem cells that are present at birth and just don't make it correctly to the uterus are stimulated to grow at the time of puberty. There's evidence that newborns have a tiny little period right after they're born, and maybe the menstrual fluid is going into the abdominal cavity at that stage or even before the babies are born. What I could say is maybe all of these mechanisms are partially true, and that there's some that are more operative in some patients than in other patients. Our work, I hope, can help us figure this out, in part by we're doing a very detailed analysis of the abdominal fluid, and once we establish that our methods have validity in adult populations, we hope to implement them in younger patient populations to try to test to see the environment around the time of puberty. So we don't have answers, but we do have ideas about how we can take the approaches we've developed and use them to illuminate this very, very challenging and still mysterious question of what causes endometriosis.
It's a much more complex disease than I had realized, because you sort of think of it as monolithic, and I've had friends who've had it, and I didn't realize that there were all these different variations in subpopulations. It's really interesting.
Yeah, the key thing I forgot to say is that we found that patients with all surgical stages of the disease had the signature of the immune networks. So that there were patients with stage 1 who had this immune signature, and patients with stage 1 who didn't have it, and all throughout. So it was a molecular classification of the patients that complements the surgical classification. Like breast cancer, two tumors that look very similar could have very different prognosis and need very different treatments when you look at their molecular profiles. And I myself had breast cancer, and so appreciate this kind of classification as being very helpful to patients.
Yeah. Allison in Syracuse asks, in a recent New Yorker article, you were just mentioning that earlier, you note that your recent research takes an engineering approach to endometriosis. What does that mean?
So engineers are used to taking big, complicated, messy problems and breaking them down into smaller parts and asking, what can we do today in the absence of complete information to try to make progress on a problem? And in particular, how can we use all different kind of mathematics to tease out patterns and see where things might be going by understanding something about mechanism and taking a semi-empirical approach. So here what we did is say, you know, if we look at information flow in the cell and in our bodies, it goes from DNA to RNA to proteins, protein activity states, and so on. And as you move up that information flow, you're integrating information from the previous method. So there's tremendous, tremendous efforts in genomic studies and in transcriptomics, all of that lower end. And so far, it hasn't really helped us move forward very far for a lot of reasons. What we said is, gee, there may be a lot of information here at the other end, where if we measure the proteins, they integrate all this. They integrate what your genes are. They integrate, were you exposed to dioxin? That's another hypothesis, that environmental chemicals contribute, but that may change your epigenetic state. Well, your proteins and protein network states are going to be a readout of that. So that's an information-rich area, but you got to know something about mechanism. You have to frame the problem. So engineers think, where could I get really useful information? So it's an insight using some of the mechanism we know, figuring out where can you make a few measurements that would open up a new direction. So it's an engineering approach. We used a lot of math, but we also used intuition and mechanism-based approaches to try to get us information where we didn't have it. So it's being agnostic to the kinds of math and looking at an end of the spectrum that hadn't really been probed very deeply before.
So moving right along, Danielle in Austin asks, your research focuses on the interdependence of biological systems. Interdependence of biological systems. Is this indicative of a larger trend?
So I'm going to interpret interdependence of biological systems to mean perhaps because that could mean a lot of things, to mean networks, that immune cells, there's all different kind of immune cells, and then there's the endometrium, and they use signals to communicate with each other, and then when a cell receives a signal, a molecule that came from a macrophage, then it has an information processing system within inside that we call the signal transduction network, and then it decides what to do. So I will interpret the interdependence to mean that these cells are in a network communicating, and if somebody over here changes something, everybody else hears about it and responds accordingly. So yes, we are trying to get more people to appreciate that you can use very powerful mathematics coupled with very strategic multiplex measurements to get into and listen in to those networks, understand them, and understand how you could perturb them in a positive way rather than a negative way. So this idea of systems biology, which arguably Doug Laufenberger, the department head of biological engineering at MIT, he's one of the fathers of this field and was recruited to MIT, in fact, to help develop this field. Many people in our department of biological engineering are very involved in this network, interdependent systems biology approach, Mike Yaffe, Forrest White, Ernest Frankel, and so on. And so trying to bring measurements and computation together to understand how all these cells are talking to each other is, I think, a really, really powerful approach that will be used for lots of diseases and is being used for Alzheimer's and inflammatory bowel disease and other diseases, kind of building on what we did in endometriosis. So my colleagues are using it for these diseases, even though I don't participate, they're using these same kind of approaches we describe here now for Alzheimer's and other diseases.
So was endometriosis the first disease to which this particular approach was applied, or?
So certainly this was one of the very first in vivo systems biology in people. And so I'd say this particular approach has been appreciated for other diseases, and this would be the first time this exact approach has been applied, but it is being applied to other diseases now, and there is in the whole systems biology community an appreciation that this can yield strong insights.
Marta asks, well, first she says, thank you for your research on endometriosis. Could you speak to what's known about the effectiveness of alternative therapies, e.g. chiropractic care, for treating endometriosis?
So we have a deficit of very well-controlled trials, in part because the metrics for what was effective or how effective something is are still a little bit squishy. You have a visual analog score for pain, for example. You have outcomes of fertility, and unless someone runs a very well-controlled trial with very well-documented metrics, it's very hard to interpret because there's often placebo effects. All of that said, there are a number of people in the field who are trying to document the effects of these, and I really admire these approaches because I believe that lifestyle and diet really can make an influence, but you do need to have data. So for example, Kevin Osteen at Vanderbilt is really doing some pioneering work on how dietary changes can influence the severity of endometriosis. I don't know about chiropractic or acupuncture or any of these other things, and I think one confounding issue for endometriosis goes back to this very problem that our research addressed. It's probably not one disease in every patient. So there's probably subsets of patients who will benefit from certain interventions that are alternative health, just as there are subsets who might benefit from drugs. And how we figure out how to assess this, to me, is a huge challenge, and I think where MIT could have fabulous impact by bringing in the people in computer science and in mobile health, where we can start to get hard data on what are metrics, how much mobility do you gain, how much better are you really feeling by using software programs and by using things like pulse, these fabulous new little Bluetooth pulse and activity meters that would let us get hard data to do trials. And so we're working with people in CSAIL and so on to develop software and so on that would help us get data from patients to let us really be driven by the data on who this would help and what the interventions do. So I think that's a barrier. We're lacking data. I think it's a really exciting thing to be thinking about, and we just need more data to guide actual actions.
Terrific. Christina in Norfolk asks, you led development of the biological engineering undergrad program, MIT's first new undergraduate major in more than 40 years. How important will biological engineering be in the future of medical research?
So it's, of course, my bias that it's going to be tremendously impactful. And when you think about it, most of the major engineering disciplines were developed at MIT and changed the world. Chemical engineering was developed when the science of chemistry went from being alchemy to being a predictable quantitative molecular science. And then engineering came along and translated those advances into things that people use and still do that. So every few decades, there's a revolution in science. MIT figures out how to take that and translate it through the prism of engineering into practical applications. So I think that the molecular to systems level analysis, where you build models of how systems work, very complex systems, is essential to both understanding and manipulating both small-scale and large-scale biological systems. So I think that many of the revolutions in health will come from this biological engineering approach because it organizes this very complicated landscape and helps us understand the important influences or not. So I think MIT has tremendous potential through this academic endeavor, which of course gets applied to many areas in ways you can't predict. Because the kids we educate, a really important thing about MIT, and I know I'm going long, MIT educates the leaders of the future. So any individual, my research program, it has impact, but the real impact are the students that I teach because they're going to be the ones who go out and change the world. And I see that every day interacting with alumni. I can't tell you how fantastic it is to see what students do when they leave MIT. With the little bit of knowledge and way of thinking we give to them, they go out and they really do change the world. So our impact at MIT is through creating this discipline and having it multiply when the students leave and take it.
This is our way of implementing Mens et Manus.
Yes, it is. It is.
Peter in Taos, New Mexico asks, why did you choose to work with patient tissue rather than cultured cells?
So so patient tissue gives us the fresh information. So we have to understand what is actually happening in the patient. When we got into this project, I thought that we would build a model of how endometrium invades in the peritoneal cavity. How does the endometrium invade the bladder? And I work in tissue engineering. I said, we'll build a tissue engineered model and then we'll put endometrium on. And then I realized, it's a lot more complicated in the body than I anticipated. We need to understand what are the important facets in the peritoneal fluid, in that pelvic fluid. What's even there? We really don't know. Thousands of papers are published on individual components, but we didn't have a picture in groups of patients who were very well cared, where we looked at everything. So we have other work, not just that one paper, but other related papers where we're looking at other facets of that environment to put together a story of how do these inflammatory molecules then influence things that we know can lead to invasion. So in fact, we do work with cultured cells in other facets of our program because we can say, how do these cytokines then drive a model of invasion? Because we can't watch invasion in a person, but we can actually take the patient's cells now and make them undergo an invasive process. So we have other work that's now illuminating that. But I think you really do need to start with the patient because that's where there's so much information of what the important variables are.
Is the center working to improve the diagnosis of endometriosis? And what are the indications for medical therapy versus surgical intervention?
So two things. The diagnosis, we would love to improve the diagnosis, and some of the work that we're doing hopefully will lead to that. I think we're also trying to enable other people working on imaging and so on. I think our software program could help do that because part of the whole diagnosis, some women will respond to hormonal therapies, and that's wonderful when it happens, or they'll respond for some period of time. So one of the things we're trying to do is build software programs that let you smoothly or enhance the patient communication with the doctor to let the doctor and patient realize when the therapies that are available now are working and when they're not, so that she can have surgery as soon as possible. Right now, surgery really is the definitive treatment to reduce pain and reduce some of the symptoms, it often doesn't, it's not a cure though. Some patients may have one surgery and it's controlled, they get pregnant and they don't have symptoms. Other patients may need 10 surgeries to control the pain and other kinds of suffering. So I think right now we're still in a landscape that's very complicated. Heterogeneous patients, most of them will need some kind of surgical intervention eventually, and some of them may need many surgical interventions.
So Daniel in Cambridge asks, you have said menstrual issues are the third rail even in the scientific community. What can the scientific community and general public do to get rid of this stigma?
So it's an interesting, and this is where I have an opinion that's not shared by everyone. It's just an impression being in the environment at MIT. I've been a faculty member here for over 20 years now, and I love MIT. I think MIT is a tremendously liberating place for women. It's a place you get to do all kind of cool science, and it's never, I've never experienced any issues with being a woman in this environment, except it actually is a squeamish topic to, if you have menstrual related health problems, it is something that is just difficult to talk about. So when I had breast cancer, everyone immediately understood this problem. The dean gave me a term of leave so I could have chemotherapy. No one was at all squeamish about the consequences of breast cancer. And plenty of people do research, there's a scientific language. But the fact that a lot of the menstrual problems are very debilitating and underdiagnosed, women are told it's in your head or you're normal, and it can be very complicated in a professional life to manage some of the symptoms. If you have a lot of bleeding, a lot of women in their 40s have fibroids, they may bleed so excessively they can't even attend a meeting. And so I think there's no way to really manage conversations about this in a professional setting, or no good ways. I won't, people in MIT are very understanding. It's not like people are it's just that it's a squeamish kind of topic. So we chose a name for our center, Gynepathology. The surgeon I work with said, that's not a word. We can't call our center that. And there's only 3 Google hits, and they weren't even from places in the US. So we actually chose that name because we can make it, we can brand it. We can say, okay, here's a scientific language to start talking about these processes. And they're fascinating from an engineering standpoint. So let's move it into a realm of science. Everybody can be fascinated with it. And then you can talk about, oh, somebody has a gynepathology. They can't come to the meeting today. And then it's not, they're using tampons.
Yeah, you make it a little bit less personal and a little bit less intimate.
Yes, it's a science thing. Oh, they have the science, the scientifically documented problem that they can't come to the meeting, not they're using 10 tampons today.
Yeah. Do you know if endometriosis is associated with women that are taking hormones directly or pregnant or breastfeeding? That was asked by Jasmine in New York.
All kinds of women get endometriosis, and enduring mystery is why some women with very serious endometriosis, meaning lots of lesions, lots of internal organ distortion, can easily become pregnant, and some women with very minimal surgically staged disease can never become pregnant. So I think we really don't understand the relationships between fertility and pregnancy and this disease, in part because it's an inflammatory disease. And when we think about it as an inflammatory disease, it starts to make sense. Many other immune disorders wax and wane with pregnancy. So anyone who's been pregnant may have had their allergies become worse or not during pregnancy.
So Kenneth in Philadelphia asks, you co-founded the center with a surgeon. How has Dr. Isaacson's non-academic, hospital-focused perspective shaped the vision of the center?
He is an academic. He's actually a professor at Harvard Medical School, and he's very highly published. He's created all kinds of surgery approaches. He actually has scientific publications from his fellowship years, but he's the president of the American Association of Gynecologic Laparoscopy, just finished being president. He's really the head, leader in developing the frontiers of academic surgical medicine, and he very much appreciates the molecular approach. So he is an academic, and yet he's a fabulous clinician. So it's really both together that he treats patients, but he comes to MIT at nights and weekends and does research with us.
It's a great combination. One last question. Mark in Cambridge asked, does your modeling suggest that superficial removal of endometrial tissue actually improves a patient's prognosis?
Our modeling doesn't suggest that. And I'd be happy to answer questions if other people have them and want to email me with them. So there's a whole literature on the removal of endometriosis that we can refer you to.
Excellent. Thank you so much. On behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, we really appreciate you sharing your insights today.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoy alumni and look forward to interacting with you more.
And thank you to our viewing audience for joining us. We encourage you to continue discussing these issues on our blog, The Slice of MIT. You could go there too and talk about it with alumni. By following the link that will appear on your screen, you can also view an archive of past faculty forums online by visiting the Learn section of the Alumni Association website. Please join us in April for the next session of the Faculty Forum online.
Thank you.
Thank you.